Hello, I'm Sami Zaidan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, health services in rich nations are struggling to cope with the coronavirus pandemic. So what about poorer nations? Will the World Bank's multi-billion-dollar fund be enough to help developing countries? Putting people before a debt crisis, Argentina gets money into the hands of families to fight the economic impact of the pandemic. And from helicopter money to universal basic income, could we see more governments picking up lost paychecks to keep the economy and businesses alive? The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund are calling on creditor nations to provide debt relief to the world's poorest nations amid the coronavirus pandemic. Rich nations have deployed unlimited funding to combat the pandemic and its economic cost. The United States and Federal Reserve have so far pledged $6 trillion. But poorer nations don't have the financial firepower of the world's richer nations. So the move to ease the pressure on the poorest nations comes at a crucial time. Health services in rich nations are being stretched by the crisis. Developing and poor nations will require support. The World Bank is making available $12 billion to support health and primary care services in low and middle-income nations. And the IMF has made $50 billion available to support emerging markets. Rising powers are also under pressure. India, for example, where 1.3 billion people are under lockdown, spends 3.7% of its GDP on healthcare. That's less than China, which spends almost 5%, according to data from the World Bank. And the next hotspot for the pandemic could be Africa. According to The Economist, more than half of African countries are above the IMF's recommended limit for public debt. Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has called on the G20 to provide $150 billion in emergency funding for the continent. Now, South Africa is in lockdown for 3 weeks. For a country that is in its second recession in as many years, it can ill afford to shut down the economy. The country's healthcare system is already struggling, and people there worry the COVID-19 pandemic could overwhelm it entirely. Al Jazeera's Famida Miller reports from Johannesburg.
Doctors detected the first case of COVID-19 in South Africa in early March. Over the past few weeks, hundreds more have been treated for the virus. As the government tries to contain the outbreak, many are worried. 28-year-old Tsepo Ngwato is one of 7 million South Africans with HIV. He says with an already compromised immune system, his priority is to keep safe.
It feels like it's another HIV reload of a sort, that we are actually re-evaluating something that has got a lot of fear towards people living with HIV, because we are in that denial of saying, what if I get infected? What's going to happen? What are the issues? What's the next steps?
Millions like Tsepo have no option but to use often overcrowded public transport. While private taxi operators have promised to disinfect and provide hand sanitizer, many have been slow to implement the new guidelines. Public hospitals and clinics are normally crowded, with people waiting for hours to see a doctor. There are concerns the coronavirus could easily spread.
When you come to our part of the world, our public healthcare systems are broken. Our intensive care units are full even before we get to COVID-19. So again, there's a real danger, and this is why I think we need international support for Africa. We need a mobilization of resources.
Poor water and sanitation infrastructure in parts of South Africa mean that many may not be able to wash their hands as often as they should, increasing the risk of contracting COVID-19. In upmarket suburbs like this one, homes and spaces are large, streets are wide. It's easier for people to keep apart. But for millions of others, the reality is quite different. Thousands of townships across South Africa are overcrowded. Dozens of families share one toilet. Streets are lined with rubbish, and people have little, if any, space to themselves. The government is using TV, radio and the internet to spread awareness as quickly as possible. and has promised quarantine spaces for people who don't have their own. It's closed schools and banned gatherings of more than 100 people. Compared to Europe and Asia, African countries have fewer reported cases of the virus. But some experts worry that poorly equipped public health systems are failing to spot the true total and warn the continent should prepare for the worst. Famida Miller, Al Jazeera, Johannesburg, South Africa.
Joining us now via Skype from Oxford is Andrew Farlow. He's a senior fellow at the Oxford Martin School at the University of Oxford. Good to have you with us. So, with healthcare systems now clearly lacking things like ventilators, protective suits, even staff, has this crisis shown just how wrong past funding policy has been towards the healthcare systems?
Yes, we've known about the risks of this happening for a long time. The World Health Organization added to its priority watch list what it called Disease X, a serious international epidemic caused by a pathogen currently unknown to cause human disease. And COVID-19 turns out to be that Disease X, spread by a virus. We've known this for a long time. We know that half of the 1,400 or so human pathogens have their origins in animals. We've had 100 emerging infections in the last century. 3, 4, 5 have gone global, 3 novel influenza pandemics, HIV/AIDS, SARS. We've known about this for a long time. The global health community has been writing reports about it for a long time. There was a report just a few years ago said that all it would take to be prepared was about $4.5 billion a year, which is less than a dollar per person on the planet, to be better prepared. What you're talking
why
about,
aren't we? What's been lacking? Money or political ideology and will?
Money because of the lack of attention of the political system, perhaps. I mean, we've had calls for money to prepare for this for some while now. One of the problems, of course, is that this is a disease, that it's an event that's a small probability, has a terrible impact when it happens. The sort of political systems perhaps don't cope very well with those sorts of things. They deprioritize them. The key thing about this, we've had opportunity, and the resources that would have been required to be more ready could have been made available and haven't. We've invested in anti-terrorism, but we're talking about something that matches more than that. It matches any wars or natural disasters, and there's been calls to deal with the chronic underinvestment in this area for a long time. It's political, but it's also, maybe the way in which we don't spot these things, we don't prioritize them enough. We're not very good globally at dealing with these sorts of events.
All right, I guess this crisis has also demonstrated the need for more government intervention in public health issues, and the private sector certainly can't face this alone. Do you think that will change attitudes in places like the US towards public funding of healthcare services?
It's a curious one because, I just mentioned that the US is actually on the metrics of preparedness is up at the top, supposedly. And yet, Trump was on the TV the other day preparing the nation for, several 100,000 deaths. The trajectories that had been put to the US were over several million deaths. So, he was portraying this as a success for getting that number under control. That teaches us that actually being prepared, you also need to be prepared and have good political leadership and coordination at the top. One of the issues with the US system, you asked about, reform of the US. One of the issues it has, of course, is it has vast numbers of its population who are not covered by that system, who are not don't have health insurance. So when they get ill or they get suspicion of being ill, certainly in the early days of the pandemic, there were lots of things in the system that operated against them actually doing something about it, or going and getting tests, or going to the hospital.
Right, you heard that it was people were trying to avoid getting tests because they can't afford the financial burden that puts on them, right?
That's correct. There's that, plus, of course, the vast numbers of the population who live, fairly low on the breadline. When we say to them, you have to isolate yourself, you have to separate yourself, you have to basically do everything to play your part to get the what we call the basic reproduction number, to get the number of people that you potentially might infect, to get that down low. Because at the moment, if it's more than 2 or 3 per person, that means everybody who gets infected spreads it to two or three more, and that's another 2 or 3 more after that. So to break that, you have to tell people to do things that are actually to some degree financially damaging to them, and you need a system that protects them. So in the US, the way in which the health system is set up, and to some degree the social security system is set up, it operates against the very measures that we actually need to see people taking.
Let me jump on a sentence you said there, the need to get people to do things that might be against their immediate economic or financial interests. When it comes to developing countries, we've got an even bigger problem, right? If you look at India, for example, they've got a lockdown there. A lot of people in the informal economy now are going without jobs, i.e. without income, i.e. without food. Is that sort, is the lockdown and the approach to coronavirus going to become perhaps as big or perhaps even a bigger threat to people than the actual coronavirus?
Yes, I mean, the problem with lockdowns is that lockdowns are not ultimately the end solution. They're not the exit strategy. They keep the numbers down. They stop the exponential growth in numbers. That, if people actually do isolate under those circumstances. The problem that we're facing in a lot of developing countries is, of course, that there aren't systems to feed you if you don't go out and get a job, or if you don't go out and do something.
Right, because developing countries can't afford to give everyone $1,200 or $1,500, right? So that's an issue.
That's correct. But the thing about the lockdown, what it's doing is it's buying time to get ready. It's buying time to get that test up and going. It's buying time to put interventions in place. The thing about the lockdown, if it actually works, and it's the same in the UK as it will be in India, if it works and it actually causes the pandemic to subside, the critical factor then is going to be how many people are actually immune within that society. If it turns out that only 10 or 20% in the UK ever got infected and are therefore immune, removing the lockdown will be quite tough, because you're inflicting, on a population, you're putting a population back into a situation where they could still get the virus. So the key thing about both in India, Africa, Brazil, I've been interacting with colleagues in these parts of the world all over this week. They're very afraid that, even with the lockdown, there's a whole raft of problems coming along for it to actually achieve its long-term aim, which is to protect human life.
All right, it's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for talking to us, Andrew Farlow. The pandemic threatens to wreck the world's most cash-strapped countries. In Argentina, 2 years of recession have resulted in almost 10% unemployment. That's expected to rise significantly after some of Latin America's strictest lockdown measures were imposed. Al Jazeera's Teresa Bo reports from Buenos Aires.
The streets of Argentina's capital, Buenos Aires, are empty these days, after the government imposed a lockdown in the country. But soup kitchens like this one cannot afford to shut down. Constanza Guillén says the amount of people coming here has doubled in the past few days.
People used to come here and sit down. They could take a shower and spend some time. Things have changed, but the amount of people coming has doubled. Many can't work and can't survive with the lockdown, and others live on the streets.
Argentina's economy was already struggling with recession and the possibility of default on its sovereign debt before fighting the COVID-19 became a priority for this country's government.
Life is difficult for many in Argentina these days. There's a rise of unemployment and poverty, and the impact that the lockdown caused by the coronavirus is having on the economy. For many, coming to this place is the only chance they have to eat at least once a day.
But it's not just the poor that are being affected. Rubén González works as a taxi driver in the city. He says he's worried with the impact COVID-19 could have in the country, but he's unsure how he will survive if the lockdown continues. He's 60 years old, and this taxi is the only way he has of making a living.
The economic situation is very, very serious. I have to pay a rent and I cannot make any money. I'm not sure what is going to happen. We are authorized to be on the street, but there is no people.
Even though the lockdown is supposed to last until the end of the month, the government might extend it for a longer period. It has also warned private creditors that Argentina's economic recovery is uncertain and that its debt crisis could be prolonged due to the coronavirus pandemic. Economy Minister Martín Guzmán says the priority right now is assisting Argentine families with extra income to survive for the next few weeks.
Economic activity is minimal because of the lockdown, and this leaves a lot of people with anguish and desperation. But we want to make sure that every person that lives in Argentina is protected in this situation.
President Alberto Fernández says he is prioritizing saving lives over the economic situation. Those who need the government's help say it's the only way they'll survive in the weeks ahead. Teresa Bo, Al Jazeera, Buenos Aires.
Now, as more than 2 billion people go into lockdown, many living from paycheck to paycheck, gig and informal economy workers are about to lose their livelihoods. The number of people filing for unemployment benefits rose to more than 3 million people in the United States alone. That's the biggest surge on record. Rich nations have stepped in to cover lost paychecks. As part of the $2.2 trillion stimulus, many Americans will receive up to $1,200 plus $500 per child. In the United Kingdom, the government has offered to cover 80% of workers' monthly pay, up to £2,500. And in Hong Kong, residents were sent checks for $1,200 each. When central banks print money, it's called helicopter money, an idea first introduced in 1969 by Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman. The idea? To get money directly into the hands of consumers. Some see it as a better way to revive an economy. Let's bring in our guest. Joining us now via Skype from London is Alfie Stirling. He's the head of economics at the New Economics Foundation. Thanks for joining us. So some governments in developed countries are now giving money directly to people rather than to the banks as they did in the last financial crisis. Is this the right approach, do you think?
Yeah, I think a direct bailout, if you like, for people is absolutely the key priority in this crisis. And actually, we've probably had too little of it. I mean, particularly in the UK and other European countries, certainly in the US. The priority has been actually to turn immediately for the banks, and it's almost as if governments were expecting to fight the last battle, the financial crisis, and they were all ready to give money to the banks. What we really needed here was to bail out people who are losing their jobs. This crisis is a result of social isolation and people not being able to go to work. So funneling money directly to people, directly into people's bank accounts is the correct approach.
Right. It is true people are losing their jobs, but people were losing their jobs in the last financial crisis too. Why do you think are governments in some of the developed countries now more convinced with the direct bailout rather than trickle-down economics?
It's partly because of the source of the crisis and the immediacy of the crisis as well. So last time we know that the source of the problem in 2008 was that banks weren't lending. So giving money to the banks was tackling the problem at source. Now, I would argue actually not enough was done in 2008 to address other symptoms as well in terms of direct money for families. But this time the problem is unavoidable. So to give you an example of just how much more severe this crisis is, in 2 weeks we've had 1 million people in the UK sign up for unemployment benefit support. In 2008, it took 3 years before the unemployment count reached 1 million. So I repeat again, 2 weeks, 1 million people. So the crisis is on a different level in terms of unemployment this time round, which is what's necessitating this much more rapid, much more urgent response from government.
All right, but will it create also problems on a much different level, i.e. inflation, debt?
So all response at the moment from government will have to be financed through debt, whether it's loans through the banks, whether it's providing grants to companies, whether it's providing income support to people. It's very unlikely to be inflationary at this moment in time, and that's because people have stopped spending. People aren't spending because they've lost their jobs and they've lost their income. So borrowing from government and injecting cash into the economy is replacing that lost income, which means it's not going to be inflationary. In the medium term, if there were to be inflation, that's actually a sign of the economy warming up again and recovering, and central banks are able to adjust interest rates to absorb that. But in the short term, the real crisis is we don't have enough inflation, we don't have enough spending pressure in the economy because people have lost their incomes.
Is this something that developing countries can emulate? In the past, developing countries have often been told to watch out for inflation when it comes to printing money and putting it in the hands of people, right? Why is it different for developed countries?
One of the relevant points here is this concept of fiscal space and how much room governments have to borrow before interest rates start to rise very rapidly on that debt. Developed economies, and particularly developed economies with an independent currency, have a lot of space to borrow and to issue bonds to markets in a way that doesn't rapidly increase interest rates. And that's partly because ultimately the central bank can always step in and step behind government. But if you're a developing economy, or you're not part, or you haven't got an independent currency, you might be heavily reliant on the dollar, for example, then you're not able to issue funds in your own currency in a way that markets trust and want to lend to. So it can become more of a problem. So it is true that different countries have different amount of fiscal space, and that will affect the extent to which governments can intervene. But right now, that such is the scale of the crisis we're facing, and such is the shock to economies, that every government in the world will have a significant amount of room to pass cash on to families.
I'd like to pick your brain on another issue. Are governments, now, well, it's kind of related to this question, are governments in some developed countries now moving towards the concept of universal basic income in all but name?
So I think this isn't happening in most countries. The United States have clearly gone down a route that looks a bit like this, and they passed on $1,200, I believe, to American residents, $1,200 per person. So that is similar to a universal basic income in some forms. But many countries haven't. Most European countries have actually stepped in to protect jobs directly. So the government has stepped in and guaranteed a portion of salaries. And that's different to a basic income, because it's actually saying we want people to keep their job, and we will pay part of the salary temporarily, so that when the crisis ends, the job is still there. It's automatically still in place.
Right, but for those countries, like you said, in the US, can we say that they're moving towards UBI?
I would fear that they are not, because you tend to see UBI in this sort of situation be most attractive in countries where the social safety net was weakest going into the crisis. So there was very little in place beforehand, which necessitates something very rapid, very quick, very simple, like a UBI type payment. But of course, it's also very easy and quick to reverse as well. If you introduce a temporary payment, a one-off check, as we're seeing in the US, there's no reason why that then is retained beyond the crisis period. So a temporary payment, yes. I don't know if this is a permanent strengthening of the United States social security system.
Could it become, well, this actually leads into another question. I mean, could it become a sort of new economic model post the coronavirus crisis, where at least, if not the whole of UBI, but some of the concepts of universal basic income sort of catch on as a new way of doing things?
I think that's a really, really important question. I think it's really hard for us to know how the politics or the lessons learned or the future context within which policymakers will operate. It's always very hard to predict which lessons are learned during a crisis. I would hope that it's inconceivable that countries like the UK, like the US, will go into another crisis with a social security system so weak as the ones that both those countries went into this crisis with. We had very, very weak safety nets, not enough protection for people losing their jobs. Now, that's not the same as saying countries will adopt a universal basic income in future. And that's partly because the big question for universal basic income is not is it a solution? Is it the best solution at any given point in time? And I think many countries will look at it and think, well, actually, given a certain amount of public resources, we're better off giving targeted funds for the people that need it rather than universal payments for everyone. And actually, if we want to go down the universal route, it's probably better to provide universal services. So housing services that are either cheap or free or subsidized, potentially food, certainly public transport, services that provide that reduce the cost of living can often be a much more efficient and cost-effective way for government to provide support.
It's been interesting talking to you. Thanks so much, Alfie.
Many thanks.
And that's our show for this week. But remember, you can get in touch with us via Twitter. Use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. There's more for you online too at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Sami Zaidan from the whole team here. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.